Cancer. That word alone carries so much weight. For a lot of us, it feels like this random, terrifying lottery, right? But what if we could totally reframe that story? What if we started seeing it less as a mystery and more as a challenge that we actually have some real power over? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dive into.
Okay, so first, let's just get a handle on the scale of this. Check this out. Global health data tells us that 1 in every 5 people will develop cancer in their lifetime. I mean, think about that. This isn't some far-off problem. It's a reality that touches pretty much every single family on the planet.
And wow, the human cost is it's staggering. In just 1 year, 2022, we lost 9.7 million people to cancer. To put that in perspective, that's like the entire population of New York City just gone in 1 year. These are really heavy numbers, I know, but they really show why this conversation is just so important.
But this leads to probably the single most important question we can ask. When you see numbers like that, it's so easy to feel powerless, but you have to wonder, how much of this is actually inevitable? And how much of it is something we can control? Because, the answer to that question, it changes everything.
So to get to that answer, we've got to first really acknowledge the sheer size of this global health challenge. Like we just saw, the numbers are pretty daunting, and, well, they're not standing still.
Yeah, in fact, if we just keep going the way we are, the World Health Organization projects a pretty staggering jump in new cancer cases. We're talking a 77% increase by 2050. So the challenge is on track to get even bigger. But, and this is a big but, that's only if we don't do anything to change the story.
And that right there brings us to the most hopeful part of this entire conversation. I'm talking about the incredible power of prevention. This is where that whole idea of it's inevitable just completely falls apart. And a new story, one about control and hope, really begins.
Okay, get ready for this, because this might be the single most empowering fact in all of cancer research. The World Health Organization says that up to 50%, half of all cancers can be prevented. Just let that sink in for a second. Not inevitable, not written in stone, preventable.
So what does that 50% number really look like? Think about all those huge, scary numbers we just talked about. Now imagine we could just erase half of them. Just wipe 50% of all that off the map. That is the potential we're talking about with prevention.
Okay, so if we know we can prevent half of all cancers, the obvious next question is, how? How do we do it? Well, the answer is all about understanding where the risk really comes from. And honestly, it might not be what you think.
A lot of us have this idea that cancer is mostly genetic, right? Something that's just passed down in our families. But the data, it tells a completely different story. It turns out that less than 10% of cancers are strongly linked to the genes you're born with, which means, get this, over 90% of the risk comes from our lifestyle and our environment.
So here's the key takeaway, the absolute bottom line. The huge majority of your cancer risk doesn't come from your DNA. It comes from things you can actually influence and change throughout your life. And that right there, that's where our power to change the outcome really comes from. Okay, so where do we focus our energy then? When you start breaking down the causes, the picture gets crystal clear. The absolute giant, the biggest factor by far, is tobacco. It's responsible for about 1/4 of all cancer deaths. It is the #1 preventable cause, period. And right behind that, you've got certain infections like HPV and hepatitis. They make up another 13% of deaths and, guess what, are often preventable with vaccines.
All right, so this is where we pivot from just knowing stuff to actually doing stuff. Now that we know lifestyle is the big driver, what does a personal prevention plan actually look like? Well, the good news is that science has really boiled it down to a few key actions that have a massive impact. Big health organizations like the WHO and the American Cancer Society, they've all kind of centered their advice around 4 main pillars. Number 1, and this is the big one, no tobacco, in any form. Second, focus on a healthy diet and maintaining a healthy weight. Third, get physically active. And fourth, limit how much alcohol you drink. Seriously, these 4 things, they are the absolute core of a powerful prevention plan.
And we can drill down and get even more specific here. So, for physical activity, we're talking about aiming for 150 to 300 minutes of moderate exercise every week. That could be something as simple as a brisk walk. And with diet, it's really all about shifting the balance on your plate. More fruits, more veggies, more whole grains, and less red and processed meats and those sugary drinks. See, these aren't crazy extreme things. They're just consistent choices that are backed by a ton of evidence. Okay, so up to now, we've been talking all about what's called primary prevention. Basically, all the things you can do to stop cancer from ever starting. But there's another piece to this puzzle that's just as important, and that's early detection. Because let's be real, the next best thing to preventing cancer altogether is finding it super early when it's at its most treatable state.
So what does that look like in the real world? Well, health experts have really clear, evidence-based guidelines for a bunch of major cancers. So, for example, we're talking breast cancer screening for women starting at 40, colorectal screening for both men and women starting at 45, and cervical screening starting way back at age 21. There are even really specific screenings, like for lung cancer in people who are high-risk smokers over 50. The goal for all of these tests is exactly the same: find cancer or even precancerous signs long before you would ever feel a symptom.
And the impact of doing this, it's huge. It's undeniable. For these specific cancers, just following the screening guidelines can lower the risk of dying by 20 to 40%, and sometimes even more than that. Screening is, without a doubt, one of the most powerful life-saving tools we have in our arsenal.
So we're kind of ending up back where we started, but hopefully with a totally new perspective. Look, cancer is a massive challenge, for sure. But it's not just a game of chance. As we've seen, up to half of it falls within our control. The power of prevention is real. It's proven by science, and it is in your hands. So the final question really isn't about what science can do anymore. It's about what you will do. What's the one step you're going to take